Evening, the wonderful Sam X.
Good evening, Eastbourne. How's my volume? Good. I often get told I'm too loud. I got quite a good action. A lot of people do this, but I do that, so I want to make sure I'm not too loud. How on earth do I follow Ronnie Big's nephew and Dropbox Della? We're going to have a go. So bear with me, this is the brightest light I've seen. I landed back in England from a month in the Moroccan desert, and that's the first light I've seen since I landed at Gatwick. It's nice to see something bright again. So I am reacclimatizing. So my two challenges are, I've not really said many words in the last month. I've been hanging out with the sort of Bedouin Berber nomadic tribes, saying things like just shukran and inshallah a few times a day about it. And when I talk on this topic, I often talk for about 3-4 hours. So perhaps it's good I haven't spoken too much in the last month, so it'll keep me down, because I've got 20 minutes, I believe. So really, I've got this quote up here. I am a wanderer, but I'll get in a good spot for you. May you live in interesting times was an ancient Chinese quote, or potentially a curse, depending how you look at it. But my argument is, I think we live in extremely interesting times. Perhaps every time you live is interesting, because that's just the nature of the human condition, that it's always interesting to us as the beholder. But I'd argue for many reasons we potentially live in much more interesting times for a number of reasons. And perhaps you could look at those times as interesting, pivotal, a culmination of things. And I think we're going to explore with you why this moment we're living in is particularly interesting, pivotal, traumatic, delete as appropriate, depending on how you feel yourself at any given time. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, what I'm really passionate about, are cycles, but I couldn't find a good image. And so what I don't mean is those cycles. So not to disappoint any bike fans, we're actually talking about these kind of cycles. So although we're going to talk about money, a lot of people get scared, we're going to talk about money, finance. We are even going to look at some financial charts, so please relax. Because whenever I speak to my dear mums in the audience, whenever I say to her, we need to ring the bank or talk about money, her shoulders go like this. And she stops breathing. So you do get a visceral response. So I just want to say, relax. Della's a poet in pajamas. I want to say we're doing finance and crypto in pajamas. Take on a bit of that style. It's all going to be all right. Don't worry. Keep breathing. Let those shoulders go. Because what I'm really passionate about is looking at cycles and seeing where we are in history. Because how on earth can we navigate where we are, navigate where we're going without understanding where we are now? Okay? And when we get curious of that, it gives us a lot of insight into potentially what's going on and why it's happening and why these times at the moment are so pivotal. And that's for all reasons. I'm going to focus in on finance and money, a subject that affects us all, but it goes for everything. These changes are happening on every level, okay? And a lot of people will be feeling that. And maybe for even some of you, this will put into perspective maybe some of the things you're feeling or experiencing, and maybe give some perspective of why it's happening at the moment, okay? So we're going to be looking at astrology. And if you don't believe in astrology, I'd suggest that's probably because of your astrology. But essentially, even if you don't believe in astrology, understand that the very top players in the world, the big wigs, absolutely do. And we talk about finance and banking. You look at the J.P. Morgan from the banking dynasty. His famous quote is, "Millionaires don't use astrology, but billionaires do." Okay, and from all my research study on this topic, the top people absolutely look at what's going on in the stars and tailor a lot of their actions to that, to harness that energy, okay? If you even go on the sort of main trading platforms, even though a lot of the traders don't believe in astrology, there is an indicator you can turn on these trading analytic platforms that shows you the full and new moons where they're coming, okay? So it's there in plain sight, and you see lots of patterns, and famously a lot of the big companies will launch on full moons, harness that energy. So whether you believe in it or not, a lot of people in the game do believe in it and run the world based on the astrology, trying to harness it. So often what I see going on is the top players are harnessing that energy. At the same time, they're using the media to kind of rubbish it. So they're absolutely living by it, and they want you to watch Mystic Meg or read the back of the paper and kind of make a nonsense of actually what can be quite useful to understand. So essentially, going back to... back to cycles. What's really interesting is we're at the confluence at the moment of about 30 to 40 cycles all confluencing around this 2020-2030 period. Okay, and I won't go into all of them, but we'll look at some of them. Some of them are astrological, some of them are socio-economic, macroeconomic, and some would argue even revolutionary cycles. So just touch on a few of them. We've got the Pluto cycle, the transit Pluto coming around, 250 years, and that goes back to the French Renaissance Revolution, the American Civil War. That energy is coming back in. We've also got the transit of Uranus every 84 years, and that will tie into the reserve currency cycle, which I'll come to shortly. And in the shorter term, we've got a very powerful 28-year financial crisis cycle. And the 28-year cycle is linked to Saturn, and the Saturn return is very powerful, that 20-year return of Saturn coming back to where it was when you were born. So often if you ask people whether they believe in astrology or not, did you have a pivotal change in your life around 27, 28, 29? Often they did. And again around 54, 55, 56, and again 83, 84, around there, the third Saturn return. And it's interesting that a lot of people, that's kind of the average age that people check out this realm and move on to the next realm, potentially because they've completed their third cycle. Maybe if you make it through that last Saturn return, you do get a little bit longer. But it's just interesting that a lot of these things, you see a lot of confluence. So 28 years is a very powerful cycle. And within that, we've got 7-year cycles play out. And 7 is a very powerful number. And these things run through everything in our world, through nature, through the markets, through the whole, I'd argue, through everything. And you think about 7's actually the average duration of a marriage lasting these days. Often you hear about a 7-year itch when people want to move house. In baseball, you've got the 7th inning stretch. So these things are encoded in our reality, but a lot of people have forgotten how powerful these numbers are. So within that 28-year cycle, we've also got 7-year cycles. So what I want to look at here is actually the reserve currency cycle, okay, which I'd argue is linked to maybe Uranus, that 84-year cycle. And essentially what you're seeing with the reserve currency cycle is the rise and fall of empires, okay? And so we're going to go back through the last century, back to around the 12th century, won't go all the way. What's interesting is that all these empires and their reserve currency, i.e. reserve currency, all that means is that is the currency of the dominant trade in power at that time. So everybody's doing commerce in that currency. So essentially, all these empires and their currencies have risen and fallen in an 80 to 128 year period, 80 to 120 years, despite there being different qualities, different times of these ages, okay? So if we begin around the 12th century, at that time, the powerhouse was Venice and Florence, with the Venetian ducat and the Florentine florin. So at that time we had two currencies dominating, and that lasted between 80 and 120 years. Then we went to the Portuguese Empire with the Portuguese real. Then we moved on to the Spanish Empire with the Spanish real at the time. Then we moved on to the Dutch Empire with the guilder. Then we moved to the French Empire with the franc, the British Empire with the pound, and then the American Empire, or what I'd probably argue is more the military-industrial complex of the United States of America, with the dollar. And what's really interesting, we are living at a time where that cycle is due to come to an end, okay? So if we then look at, again, our 28-year cycles, going back through history, we can start to see how many pivotal things have happened in the last century alone. I won't go back in the other centuries, but just in this century, if you think about it in financial terms, let's just look at a few key dates. The end of the First World War, okay, 1917-18, around that time, that was a financial reset, because wars are about a transfer of power and also a transfer of wealth. And I'd argue the bankers play a huge role in wars. Many of the world wars are bankers' wars, I'd argue. So in essence, the end of a war is a financial reset. 28 years later, we have the end of the Second World War, okay? And in 1944, we have the Bretton Woods Agreement, which cements the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, okay, officially, backed by gold. And we'll come back to that because that's important. And that whole agreement, the Bretton Woods Agreement with the dollar backed by gold, lasts how many years, anybody? 28 years. We go forward to 71, around that time, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. Okay, and we're going to come back to that. It's very important. If we go on 28 years from there, that takes us to a really pivotal time, about 2000, 2001. We had the dot-com bubble, and we also had some events of 9/11. I always say this. Every sentence I say, I could do a 3-hour tangent on, and often do online in different talks, but that's not for tonight. We're just doing another 11 or 12 minutes. But yeah, these are the kind of things I talk in great depth, but here we're just touching on them briefly. So what's interesting, it's going to be really interesting to see where the next 28-year cycle comes in, because it's the end of this decade, heading towards 2030, okay? 28, 29, 30, around that area. That's the next Saturn return, where we're looking at financial crisis cycle. And interestingly, on one of those 28-year cycles, 1971, we had the launch of the World Economic Forum, who play a very vast role in our world today. Not, I'd say, for good purposes personally, but that's another matter. And a lot of what we're talking about in the UN is Agenda 2030. A lot of things are purported for change towards that, because the biggest players in the world absolutely understand these cycles, but they don't necessarily want you, the people, to understand the cycles. They don't want you to know who you are, where you are, or what's going on, is my argument. So essentially, really interesting times. And if we go back to, so you can see that 1944 Bretton Woods, when the dollar was cemented as the reserve currency of the world, we are now between 80 and 120 years on from there. So we're the beginning of the fall of the dollar, okay, which will play out over the next 20, 30 years, I'd argue. And that's where you're seeing the rise of the BRICS nations, okay, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, more countries joining that conglomerate. And interestingly, not that long ago, I think it was I've lost track of how much time's gone by, maybe the summer before, we had India buy its first million barrels of oil, of Saudi oil, in rupees. That was really signaling the changeover from the dollar being the reserve currency and challenging that power. So we're seeing that shift happen. So that's all playing out. Now, what's really key about what happened in 1971 is that at that point, okay, from 44, the Bretton Woods Agreement, to 71, we were dealing with real money, okay? So the dollar was backed by gold. So what we are living with today is fiat currency, okay? Fiat currency just means it has value because we say it has value. Fiat means by decree. Whereas prior to 1971, the world reserve currency was real money, because essentially what you had was still notes, but they were real promissory notes, i.e. I promised to pay the bearer, and you could cash them in for the real underlying worth. So that was real money, okay? Really important difference. So that's where we talk about the difference between sound money and unsound money. Gold has long been known as sound money because the qualities of sound money is scarcity. Therefore, something holds its value because it's scarce. And the cost of bringing new currency or new money into circulation, there is a cost. And if you think about it, to get some more gold, you've got to go and mine it. You've got to spend that energy, that output. There's a cost to bringing new gold. It's still quite scarce. You're not going to bring loads more in, but there is a cost to bring it more in circulation. Whereas with fiat currency that is backed by absolutely nothing, it is unlimited supply. It is printed away endlessly. And today, there is zero cost to bringing more into circulation. Perhaps in the old days, there were printing presses, and it did cost a little bit of paper and a bit of money. Now, you just type it into a screen, okay? So it's a really important shift in a few people's lifetimes in this room, where actually we went from having real money to having complete funny money. And the top players fully understand that, but the majority of people are not educated about money. I did A-level economics and didn't learn anything about money or economics. And, you know, that's by design, I'd argue. Okay? So really what I'm passionate about is getting clear, because it's not super complicated, but it has been kind of obfuscated and made difficult for people to understand. So essentially, what happened, 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, we're on the gold standard. 28 years later, in simple terms, the US had a bit of a trade deficit. They had spent more money than they had gold in the vaults, and they owed countries like France and Germany that owed them some gold. But rather than pay them, they threw the monopoly board up in the air and said, we changed the rules. Okay? And of course, they didn't give a very clear explanation to the people. They gave Nixon at the time gave a very jingoistic kind of speech, as they do, saying, we need to protect you, the American people, and our precious US dollar against outside threats. Now, those outside threats were just people who genuinely they owed money to. But of course, they use this language, they always use that same language, outside threats, keep you safe, protect you. But essentially, it was the biggest swindle in history. Because at that point, what did they say? They said it's a temporary measure. Governmental temporary measures are famous because they never return. They are the least temporary things going. So essentially, Then Nixon got involved, and the Watergate's all forgotten. The real problem is most people had no idea what had happened. But the people who understood money did understand what happened, and they took action. Okay, and Ray Dalio, who's one of the most successful fund managers in the world, tells a really important story, greatest life lesson he ever had, that he was a 21-year-old trader on Wall Street at the time. And although he didn't understand, the whole way things have played out and the whole setup, because he was a young trader, he at least understood that this news about defaulting on their payments and coming with the gold standard was bad news economically. So he expected to go into Wall Street the next day, the bell to ring, and for the markets to crash on this bad news. He had the biggest wake-up call of his life when he went in the next day, the bell rang, and the markets went on a huge tear-up. And he said it was the biggest life lesson he ever had, changed his whole mindset, and the biggest lesson. Because what he realized was anybody who understood money took action, because they understood that if they were sitting with their wealth in dollars, that prior to that were tied to real wealth, real worth, tangible assets, and therefore were scarce and would hold their value, suddenly were depegged from that and would be printed away ad infinitum, as has happened in the last 80 years. Okay? So the people who understood that got the hell out of the US dollar and moved their worth into assets, in the asset side of the equation. Hence, the stock market going up. Okay? And that's really important to understand, because if we look at the difference, what happened to the dollar, but also to the pound, to all the big currencies, a lot of smaller currencies have risen and fallen before that, but we're going to look at the strong currencies. That essentially, okay, we're looking at the so-called Great British Pound, okay, because what's happened in 1971, at the end, when it's still on the gold standard, £10,000 would have bought you 635 ounces of gold. Fast forward to year 2000, £10,000 gets you 63.5 ounces of gold. Fast forward to a couple of years ago, £10,000 will only buy you 6.5 ounces of gold. And we've gone further. Now, what's really gone on here? People think, oh, gold's gone up a lot. Gold hasn't moved. The fiat currency has collapsed. So essentially, in real simple terms, if you'd had a little nugget of gold in your pocket in 1971, and you went to London, and you paid for your first-class train fare, you paid for a nice meal, a night in a hotel, and maybe a train fare back, the same amount, little nugget of gold, would do the same today. So gold has held its value because it's sound money. Whereas your pounds have lost 99% of their purchasing power since 1971. So this is the great trick. A lot of people are scared of assets because they're confused by financial charts and the volatility. And they believe that they're in this chart straight across. They believe I've got £100,000, I haven't spent any, it's just going across. The reality is, if your family held their wealth in pounds, and we talk about dollars, pounds, all the big currencies, we're talking about the strong currencies being down 99. As I said, a lot of currencies in weaker nations have completely collapsed and disappeared. Talk to people in South America about hyperinflation. But essentially, even if you had the strong pound, you have lost 99% of your purchasing power. So if your family had £100,000 worth of wealth in 1971, left it in the bank, today they are down 99%, essentially got less than £1,000 of purchasing power. Whereas if they'd moved sideways at that time, understood what had happened, they could have protected their purchasing power to be as wealthy as they are today as they were in 1971. So that's why it's important to understand sound money versus unsound money. Fiat currency is being printed away endlessly. This chart shows it, and that is continuing. So when you go into Pret a Manger and the carrot cake is now half the size it was and 3 times the price, that's partly due to the money printing, not because of the Ukraine war, I'd argue. Okay, so understanding money, although it seems like a really boring topic, is actually really important, because the smart money, those who understand it, are always taking action to preserve their wealth. Okay? So another big shift I'm going to show, we're going to come on, is that actually one of the biggest shifts we're happening is, this is just a graph just to see a nice sunny day on such a bleak day here, but essentially the biggest shift that's going on, which is why I think it's even more pivotal, we talk about the early shifts that are happening, is that there is a big change of ages, the astrological ages. So we have spent about 2,000 years in the age of Pisces, which is a water sign. Hence, all those empires I talked about and all those money systems and legal systems have been based on the water. So we've been talking about citizenships, partnerships, liquid currency, frozen asset. When you go to the court, you're in the dock. This is all water language from the age of Pisces. And essentially, I think a lot of the big power players go back to the Phoenicians, who became the Venetians. And that's a really interesting rabbit hole. But all the power structures go back to places that were on water, okay, like Venice. But essentially, what we are lucky enough to be experiencing is we are transiting into the next age. Okay, it's going to take some time, but it's in the process of happening. From the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And Aquarius is an air sign. So we're moving into the cloud. Hence why Della was allowed to stalk her ex-partner in Dropbox. Due to the age of Aquarius. Stella, you'd struggle down here. You would have to put a message in a bottle. But now, Dropbox in the age of Aquarius, no problem. You can become the poet with the pajamas. So that's all down to that. So essentially, that is really why I want to demystify what's happening with finance, is that finance is also shifting from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, from water to air, and going digital, okay? Which moves us to this, okay? And essentially, this is a slide about Bitcoin. You might not look it, but this is really to talk about the rise of Bitcoin, because this Bitcoin arose out 2008, after the great financial crisis then, and essentially in 2010, at those times, it's just computer geeks handing it round. A lot of people didn't really know it was going. And this guy was a recipient of the first real-world Bitcoin transaction. So there's a message board at the time where somebody said, I will offer 10,000 Bitcoin if somebody goes and gets me a pizza, okay? And this guy took up the offer, accepted the 10,000 Bitcoin, which was about $20 at the time, and got these pizzas. Today, that 10,000 Bitcoin is worth just shy of $1 billion, okay? About 950 million. Could be 940, I haven't checked the price in the last few hours. But essentially what we're looking at is the rise of Bitcoin. And what I'm really talking about is the rise of digital and the financial system going digital, because Bitcoin essentially is like a digital gold, okay? And I educate about Bitcoin crypto, not because I'm like evangelist, you must get into this, because there's so much confusion, misinfo, disinfo around this topic that it's important to understand it. And believe me, the top people do understand it, and they don't want you to understand it. So I'm all about empowerment so people can make good choices themselves and understand where they are, not to promote crypto or gold, silver, just understand things. So essentially, we've seen the rise of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is like a digital gold, because gold has been sound money, but there are issues with gold, because how transportable is gold? How divisible is gold? How verifiable is gold? Interestingly, what you've got with Bitcoin is you've got, using the digital age, you've got a sound money system, so it is scarce like gold. It has a finite supply, it's even scarcer than gold. It is totally verifiable, because only Bitcoin will run on the Bitcoin network. There's no way to have fake Bitcoin. And it is infinitely divisible with no problem. So actually, when people say to me, well, Sam, Bitcoin's not worth anything, okay? I know people are saying it's 100,000 a Bitcoin at the moment, $100,000. That's not me saying it's worth that. That's not any Bitcoin fan saying it. That's the market saying it, because it does have values. It has qualities that gold doesn't have, okay? So in a sense, you could almost see it as a gold for the digital age. And it's really important to understand, because there are a number of problems with the fiat system. The main problem being, okay, that it's unsound money, that we agree on. The second problem is that of the censorship of transaction. When you're dealing in the fiat currency system, the banking system, anybody can censor your transaction, okay? The other problem, obviously, is that you're losing value in it. And the other problem is that it's totally permissioned. So if you want to have a bank account, you need to ask permission. You need to give your identity or your papers. What you have with Bitcoin, which is why all the top players in the world use it as well, is you have a digital money system that is verifiable, that is sound money, that is permissionless and censorship proof. So if you want to send £1 million to somebody, even though it's all paid up, you've all been through all the checks, everything, It's going to cost you a lot of money and a lot of paperwork and a lot of time. You could do that on the Bitcoin network in 5 minutes, no questions asked. And it is not a transaction between Sam and Tim. It is just between two accounts. And anybody have a Bitcoin account within 5 minutes in this room. If you've never had crypto, you could download an app, have yourself an address. We could transact peer-to-peer. So it has all these qualities. So I always want to say the reason Bitcoin is trading at almost $100,000 a day is because it's A, sound money, and because it has qualities that gold doesn't have, and it has qualities for a digital age. And just to demystify, this is the growth chart of Bitcoin. It's not updated because this is the last few cycles. We're actually now, you see how out of date, we're actually trading around $100,000. But what I want to show you briefly is this. I've gone over time, but that's probably why Tim put me last. Tim, what time do we get kicked out? Couple of minutes. Is what we can see is the price of Bitcoin. It's bull and bear markets. But what I really want to demystify, because people sometimes think it's just Bitcoin. I don't understand, what it's doing. It goes up and down. It's scary. It is reacting to macroeconomic factors like any other asset. So I want to really take out some of the fear of it. Oh, it's just doing crazy things. Essentially, it's in its growth cycle as a new asset. But why I've overput this line, this orange line is the dollar strength index. It's called the DXY. And in simple terms, it represents a lot of different things, but essentially it's a good indicator of money printing, quantitative easing, i.e. expanding the money supply and devaluing it. So we talked about what happened in the stock market. When they started printing the dollars, it was no longer backed by gold. People moved into assets. So what you can see is quite an interesting inverse correlation. As they print lots of dollars, the dollar's going down, Bitcoin's going up. As they do a bit of quantitative tightening, we have the opposite. So you can see every time we have a Bitcoin peak, we usually have a dollar low, okay? Peaks there and the lows, peak, low. And a great example here, this is COVID, okay, March 2020. What did they do there, the power structure? They printed about 80% of the money that's in circulation today was printed since then. That again is why your Pret-a-Manger carrot cake. I'm sorry to go on about it, but it used to be my favourite cake at Pret-a-Manger. Now it's one bite and it's about £8. But essentially, printed all that money, Bitcoin goes from $3,000 to $69,000, while fiat currency is devaluing, okay? But really, because of these cycles, what's going on, a lot of people don't understand about it. A lot of people just hear the news, which is run by the same people who have confused you about the money system in the first place, and they just heard that Bitcoin's crashed, everyone's lost all their money, you want to stay nice, safe here, okay? Whereas in reality, if you'd bought Bitcoin here, even if you hadn't taken profits at the top, if you'd waited for the big crash, which is a normal bear market, a normal contraction after a big growth cycle, when they start doing quantitative tightening, your asset would still have gone from 3,000 to 15,000 after the big crash where everyone thinks they've lost all their money. Whereas the fiat, you might be down 20, 30%. So that's not me to say get yourself on Bitcoin. It's you to understand what's really going on outside the noise, because I hear so much nonsense talked about and people scared by news stories. So trying to demystify it can be really, really important. And to put that the shift into context, because this is a paradigm shift, what's going on. Essentially, this is a technological shift. Bitcoin is just the first iteration of a bigger shift, and it's the internet growing up. Because surprise, surprise, the internet is having its Saturn return. So the 28-year cycle that affects our lives, affects the financial system, is also affecting the internet. Because the internet, as we know it, Web 1.0, came into being around sort of 93, 94. Okay, read-only internet, when we've got our first emails, it wasn't that long ago. And then 14 years later, i.e. halfway through, when it became a pesky teenager, halfway through its Saturn return, we had the launch of Web 2.0, which was really the beginning of the participatory internet. Things like social media, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. There we're just reading it, we're not interacting. There we are uploading our data, interacting with it. But what's important is it's all completely centralized. So you upload your videos to YouTube, YouTube own and control them. You upload your photos to Facebook, Facebook own them. Della's husband uploads his files, private files to Dropbox, Della owns them. That's an anomaly, okay? But if only he'd known a little bit more about Web 3. He was too early. Web 3, he could have kept his privacy. So, interesting, that's a huge problem because, again, the products, they're all free because you are the product, okay? Data is, in the digital age, data is oil, right, okay? It's really important. It's very valuable. But the real problem there is you upload your video to YouTube. If Mark and Tim put this video on YouTube and the people who fund YouTube and bear with YouTube don't like something I've said, they can censor it and pull it down. Nothing I can do because they own it. Okay? And that's why 14 years later, we are a really important, interesting time. We're at the birth of Web 3. So that is basically a 28-year cycle to get from Web 1 to Web 3. Web 3 is the beginning of blockchain and decentralized internet, which Bitcoin, okay, is a version of. So essentially, we are moving from apps to dApps, applications to decentralized applications. And that's a really important shift. Apps changed the way the world worked. So 2008 is when the iPhone came out, changed the way we transact everything. Web 3 and dApps are about to do the same. Think how much the world has changed in the time since Web 2 apps came into place. This is in process. I'll just give you a quick example before we wrap up. What we have now are versions of YouTube like Odyssey, okay, where you can upload your content. And because it's hosted in a decentralized manner, as Bitcoin is, everybody running the Odyssey software is essentially hosting all the data. So a lot of people have been censored off YouTube in the last few years, moved to something like Odyssey. It's censorship proof. You want to take down the video of Odyssey, you've got to take down everybody across the world running the Odyssey platform. If you want to take down Bitcoin, you've got to find everybody running the Bitcoin software across the world. So decentralization means censorship proof. Okay, really powerful technology. And there's also lots of other things baked into it about keeping hold of your privacy. So another great example, you use Google Chrome, Google's browser. They are rinsing your data. They're advertising to you. They're doing all that. You use Brave browser, which is a Web3 blockchain version. It's basically a copy of Chrome, but you choose your level of privacy. You choose how much advertising you see. And if you choose to see advertising, because that's part of an ecosystem of value, you get paid. That is the essence of Web3. You are an active participant in that ecosystem. In that ecosystem, you are being sucked on by a parasite. And in this one, you have a say in how you involve that ecosystem. And if you do add value to it, you are rewarded with value, okay? Now, I've touched on some really complex topics, and I just want to give you an I've gone over as usual, but this is the topics I talk about because it's a really pivotal time in history. Understand this is really beneficial and helpful for lots of people. That's why I've ended up just giving a few talks, and I've now ended up going around the world talking about this topic because it's so critical to understand, because you don't need to be a victim of changing times. You need to understand them, pivot, and then you can take really positive proaction. So I'm sure we might have some questions, but I've got a podcast where I go deeper in these things. I've got lots of resources. Anyone wants to come and chat to me, take my card, love talking about this topic. And as I said, usually I talk for 3-4 hours, and I've done 32 minutes. So I've gone over by half already. Sorry, Tim. But thank you for having me, and I hope you had a good evening.
Thank you so much, Sam X.